speak in person and over a dozen times, and I always come away feeling smarter and very appreciative that I once again learned something new. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor John Robson.
At this point, I have to go through the cyborg routine where I set up all the digital gear. I do have the world's best slideshow presentation, but regrettably, the technology doesn't speak to the other technology quite properly, and therefore you will just have to imagine how enjoyable my presentation would have been if only somebody had a laptop into which we could plug a USB. Right, okay. So how is that better? Do I have to lean way in, or is it okay if I just do this? Okay. Now, it is a great pleasure to be here and to speak to this wonderful group on the documentary which we have just completed and released, our little family firm here. I've brought my VP of Marketing, who has, of course, other items which she would be happy to retail to you when we're done. And particularly to be here because it's a bit of a closing of the circle. It was encouragement from various CLF members that persuaded us to go ahead with this project a year ago in the first place. And I say that the documentary is not just out, it's also about. Kim has a big box of them, and so I'm neither going to play it nor recapitulate it here before you today. There's a story about Harvey Penick, a great golf teacher. And when someone started into an excessively long and boring anecdote about what had just happened to them on the course, Harvey would say, well, hang on a second here, are we going to replay all 18? Because if we are, I think I better go get a cart. And in this case, there's a danger of us replaying all 2,000 and you needing a chariot. Because the documentary, as you will see, and when you watch it, goes all the way back to the end of Roman Britain. And the reason that it does that, and you've seen this if you watch the Magna Carta documentary, is that I'm a great believer in Canada's heritage. And when I talk about Canada's heritage, I don't mean something that started in 1982. I don't mean something that started in 1968. I don't even mean something that started in 1867. Because the people who created this country were drawing upon a tradition they were very proud of, that went back into the mists of time. And it is that heritage that is the guarantor of our rights in all kinds of areas, including the right not to have the state start trying to tell us what language we're meant to be speaking. And so I'm here to talk, of course, about some of the major flaws of the 1982 Constitution, but also to try to put them in context. And that's probably because to tell this audience what's wrong with the 82 Constitution is a bit like bringing coals to Newcastle or trying to tell Harvey Penick how to hold a golf club. You'll get to ask questions afterwards, so revenge will be yours in the long run if I patronize you or otherwise misuse you as an audience. But the main thing that's wrong with the 1982 Constitution, I gotta take a big breath here because it's a long list, isn't it? But the single thing that is most wrong with it, that captures its flaws, is that it continued the process of expanding the state at the expense of citizens. And it's ironic, given that Pierre Trudeau thought himself a champion of individual rights, but he didn't even initiate, he continued a process of submerging the rights of the individual in the collective, and depriving us of our standing in the face of an increasingly powerful and increasingly ambitious state. It's ironic that Trudeau would create this result, but there's a lot that's ironic about Pierre Trudeau. In 1967, according to a great fan of his, Thomas Axworthy, Trudeau claimed, and I quote, "The only constant factor to be found in my thinking over the years has been opposition to accepted opinions." Or in the spirit of this gathering, I should say, il ne faut pas chercher d'autres constantes en français que celle de s'opposer aux idées reçues.
Stop it.
There's nothing wrong with being bilingual. There's only something wrong with the policeman's truncheon coming down over it. But what's wrong with that statement, of course, is that Pierre Trudeau almost literally never had a single original thought in his life. You look at it, when he was a young man, he was isolationist. He didn't pay attention to the Second World War. He seems to have been anti-Semitic. He was ultramontane. Then you get into the 1940s and he's very pro-labor union. You get into the 1950s, he becomes existentialist. In the early 60s, he's a Maoist. By the late 60s, he's a hippie. then he starts following the writings of John Kenneth Galbraith in the 70s. In the early 80s, he's a peacemaker. Right? He's blowing with the wind. It's the most remarkable thing. The apple does not fall far from the tree. There are some virtues and many failings in our current Prime Minister that, to me, very much resemble those of his father. And one of the classic ones is being so trendy that he's all sail and no anchor. I can safely digress to dwell on the failings of Pierre Trudeau in this audience, but this is not exactly a digression, because when it came to the 1982 Constitution, we were living in a world in which government was gathering more and more power and authority, and traditional restraints on the state were breaking down. And Pierre Trudeau continued that process with an almost pristine lack of awareness that he was doing it. The sublime failure to introspect that characterized him was very much on display here. And so, the 1982 Constitution is a very bad document in that it gives the state more power at the expense of the citizen. But it's also a very bad document because of the fact that it continues the process of doing that. And Trudeau lacked the originality suddenly to turn this country in an undesirable direction. What he had was the kind of style and insouciance to accelerate our traversing of a path that we'd been on for some time. And in order to see the 82 Constitution in its proper context, and that's what we do in the documentary at some length, you may say, if you do try and watch it, is to illustrate what had been going wrong and how the 1982 Constitution is much to be deplored, both for what it did do and for what it did not do. Because there was a need for constitutional reform. There were things that were very pressing by 1982, and none of them even got considered. And that's why I say that the problem with the 82 Constitution is not that it elevates the state above the citizen, but that it continues the process of expanding the state at the expense of its citizens. And it's kind of a funny thing to talk about the 1982 Constitution, because in a way the thing is a stub. It's very incomplete. We did not have a constitution in 1867 that was then replaced by a constitution in 1982. Or as in 1867, we didn't have a constitutional order that was cast anew by a document, the British North America Act, as it was once happily called. There's a much more resonant name than the Constitution Act 1867. It's like changing Dominion Day for Canada Day, among other things. It makes the nation more drab, and I see no need for us to be drab. But the 82 Constitution is only a partial document. It leaves much of the British North America Act intact. And essentially, if you look at the 82 Constitution, what you see is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and then this enormous googlehoy of the amending formula. Now, in fact, that's not quite right. If you look at the table of contents, you see that for the first thing in the 82 part of our Constitution is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Then there is the rights of the Aboriginal people of Canada. This part is frequently treated as though it were part of the Charter, but formally it's not. Then you get equalization and regional disparities, which again is often alleged to be part of the Charter, but formally speaking is not. Then you get a section and a half devoted to constitutional conferences. Only in Canada would we have that. Then you get this incredible amending formula, or imitation of same. And then you get some technical amendments to the 1867 Constitution, and then you get general. And the part of the constitutional conferences is also odd, because these were self-repealing provisions. They provided for one constitutional conference on Aboriginal affairs within 1 year, and then a couple more within 5 years. And it's kind of hard to know, why would you need a provision to repeal something that says you have to have a conference within a year? You either have the conference or you don't, and after that it doesn't much matter. But anyway, you now have to follow the footnotes. And we actually did have those conferences. We had one in the first year, and then we had three, and they accomplished absolutely nothing. Which again, that's the Canadian way, isn't it? To have those premiers and prime ministers and various do-gooders gather at great expense and dine upon moose and Saskatoon berry sauce and that sort of thing, and say how wonderful it would be if only they could find a way to deliver on all the stuff they said they were going to do, but since they can't, so we'll see you later. Disappointing to Aboriginals as to non-Aboriginals, because the promise seemed so exciting and then turned out to be so empty. So that leaves us with some housekeeping. It leaves us with the charter and its kind of satellite components, and the amending formula, which is such a mess that nobody, including the Supreme Court, actually knows what it says. Of course, it doesn't really matter to the court because they have this magical ability to discern a constitutional architecture that no mere mortal can see, and therefore it does not matter to them what is actually in the written Constitution, because there are all these other things, not including Magna Carta, which they can discern when they need to in order to tell us that some deprivation of rights is not merely justified, but positively admirable. What the amending formula does not contain is we the people. There is essentially no way that Canadians have access to their Constitution. To make small changes, for instance, to how we elect senators, to make large changes, for instance, putting property rights in the charter. There are various ways in which politicians can get together and cut deals, though these sections, there's almost 1,100 words of the stuff, they do appear to contradict one another, and if you had my slideshow, there would be a bunch of print you couldn't even read from the front row, because that's what a mess the thing is. But it's not an accident that it left us out. It is, however, a betrayal of our constitutional tradition, because fundamental law in the English-speaking world has come from the people since before the Norman conquest of England. Anglo-Saxon communities govern themselves according to a gathering of the entire people. The king in Anglo-Saxon England, when he issued a decree, was not laying down a rule. He was ratifying a decision that had been taken by the people. Magna Carta, as an expression of the demand of the people of England that their rights be respected, is very much an exercise in what is called technically popular sovereignty. That fundamental law comes from the people. When the American founding fathers write a constitution that says we the people, they are not innovating, and they don't think they're innovating. They are following in the footsteps of those who fought for freedom, going back through the struggles with the Stuarts in the 17th century, the Tudors in the 16th, with bad King John in the 13th, and so into the mists of time. And in 1867, when Confederation was proposed, 1864-65, leading to the adoption of the BNA in 1867, there was a lively debate in this country about how to consult the people. And some said, we really should have a referendum. Other people said that's not how the parliamentary system works. Parliament really does represent the nation. And there was a third group that said, yes, it does, but on something this big, Parliament needs a fresh mandate. You need to have an election in which it is clear to the voters that the main question that will be before this new legislature is, shall we or shall we not join Confederation? And in most of the colonies that joined initially, that's precisely what they did. They consulted the people, because nobody in this debate over how to consult the people, nobody denied that you had to consult the people. Nobody thought that it was not the Canadian way to have fundamental law come from the people. And obviously, in 1982, that did not happen. The election of 1980 was not held essentially on a constitutional document that the people were allowed to see and asked to decide on. And I think a very glaring illustration of that is that Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in 1980 because his party had 74 out of 75 seats in Quebec. Without that, he would not have had his majority in the House of Commons. And yet Quebec has consistently refused to sign the Constitution. This has no legal force, but it shows you how alienated Quebecers are from that document, that neither Parti Québécois nor liberal Quebec premiers have ever been willing to say, yes, we accept the Constitution Act. So this is a betrayal of the right of the people to choose how they shall be governed. And in our Constitution documentary, we insist that this must be addressed. We actually created a draft Constitution, which you can download from our website, and it says this can only be adopted if we have a referendum. We are now so deep into this territory that it can only be done that way. And then we create an amending formula, whereby if we want to change our Constitution in big ways or small, you need to have a vote of 2/3 of each House of Parliament, and then ratification by 3/4 of the provinces and territories. And we have lots more goodies, by the way. We increased the number of provinces and territories because we proposed splitting up Ontario and Quebec, as well as BC and Alberta and even Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Because you should have lots of members of the Federation. Government should be close to the people. It is wrong, for instance, that decisions about Ontario affairs are made fundamentally by the inhabitants of Toronto. But it is also wrong that Toronto is not itself a province. Toronto is big enough and has problems that are so Torontonian in nature, which in good ways as well as bad, that they should have the authority of a province. So should Montreal. But none of this should happen unless the people of those regions agree to it. So you have a referendum, those who want the new constitution become the new Dominion of Canada. In those places where it is voted down, they remain part of the old Canada, or they find their own way forward. And the first thing that you will find in our Constitution, other than the very general statements about the fact that we're creating a new country and that it has the rule of law under God and so on, is the Charter of Rights. A real Charter of Rights that we put in first place. Because when you look at what is wrong, actively wrong, sins of commission in the 1982 Constitution, curious enough, the worst thing about it is actually the Charter of Rights. And what's wrong with the Charter of Rights primarily is not the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause used to bother me a great deal because I thought, why would you give a right and then take it back? Later I came to have more respect for those who had held out for it because I read Albert Van Dicey, which is the sort of thing I do for fun, writing about the parliamentary system in the very early 20th century, and I came to realize that from the point of view of the British and from the point of view of the founders of Canada in 1867, popular control of Parliament was the essential safeguard of our liberties. That it was Parliament who had obstructed the Stuart kings. It was Parliament who had defended our right not to be taxed without representation. It was Parliament that in so many ways had protected us. And although I think the notwithstanding clause is a mistake, it was a mistake that was inspired by people who thought that system still worked. And I will give them half credit for that. But what's really wrong is the Section 1 bolt hole that says, and I quote from my slideshow here, which you can all not see, that, here we go, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And that is a get out of jail free card for the executive and the judiciary to take away your rights. Because they say, well, social science tells us that if the human units are forced in this direction, they will enjoy greater flourishing. That is an incredible thing to have put into the Charter, and it has nothing to do with trying to preserve the rights of Parliament. It's simply there to let them do things to you, even if you're told that you have rights like free speech, they can shut you up. You have the right to due process, but they can jail you without following it. You look back at the notwithstanding clause, and of course the notwithstanding clause is weird too, because it covers fundamental rights. The notwithstanding clause covers freedom of conscience and religion. It covers freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press. It covers freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. It covers due process. The state is officially authorized to take these things away from you, but it doesn't cover affirmative action. You can't invoke the notwithstanding clause to strike down affirmative action. It doesn't cover promotion of French. It doesn't cover multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is entrenched in the Charter beyond the reach of the notwithstanding clause. But nothing in the Charter is entrenched beyond the reach of that Section 1 bolt hole. And I promise you, if you read our draft Constitution, you will find no such bolt hole. Because My view is that in a free and democratic society, the state cannot take away your rights. That is, in fact, the definition of a free and democratic society. That is what this whole long struggle is about, to get an effective writ of habeas corpus, to prevent the king from raising revenue through forced loans or through ship money or all these other historically tedious and peculiar expedients that people had used. And this is a system that had grown up over many centuries. Again, our Magna Carta documentary covers this in great detail. It's available free online, so if you have not watched it, I hope that you will. If you want to buy a copy and help keep me talking, that's good too. But you got a system where by 1867, through many trials by fire and blood, it's not often appreciated. The English Civil War against King Charles I in the middle of the 17th century caused more deaths per capita in England than the First World War did. Freedom is not cheap. But by 1867, if you look at Britain and what's happening in Britain, the state is tiny, maybe 10% of GDP. Property rights are secure. Gun ownership is entirely unregulated. London, in the late 19th century, this great metropolis, some 8 million people, has maybe 2 gun murders a year. But there are no restrictions on guns. In 1895, somebody tried to put a restriction on handguns through the British Parliament, but it was rejected as unnecessary, futile, and grandmotherly. I mean, no offense to the grandmothers in this room, many of whom probably do actually own handguns, but this was a world in which the state was small and deliberately so. And when we are given a constitution in 1867 that is, quote, similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, and I'll make this point in the documentary, you look at that and think, maybe they had too much champagne at Charlottetown. How could they have said such a thing? Our Constitution was written and federal, and the British Constitution was neither. How could you call these things similar in principle? But the answer is it was intended to be a minimal state in which citizens kept the executive from getting too big for its britches via their control of the legislature. And this was a wonderful system which we started to lose by the early 20th century. We started to lose it because the executive began to absorb the legislature. The stage grew too large to be responsive or sensitive. The people were gradually squeezed out, and then in 1982, Pierre Trudeau and his fellow sorcerer's apprentices gave us this unidentified constitutional object, which embodies neither popular nor parliamentary sovereignty, which is neither fish nor flesh, but is certainly foul. And we let it happen. I mean, not you, I can tell that you people have been in high dudgeon ever since, but Canadians generally did so. And they did so in part because they do not, I think, entirely appreciate that they have this heritage of freedom. We're told freedom is somehow un-Canadian. And that is one of the points on which we must push back, because that sentiment would have astonished the fathers of Confederation. If you actually read the debates around the British North America Act in Canada, liberty is on everyone's lips. Those who support Confederation say, keep your British liberty, Confederate. Those who oppose Confederation say, keep your British liberty, stay as you are. Darcy McGee says that the colonists are the freest people on earth, and he's not complaining. But we were free in a system in which Parliament effectively had sovereignty. There's an expression by Jean-Louis Delhomme, who wrote a brilliant commentary on the Constitution of England in the 18th century, which he's now almost completely forgotten. But he was well known in the 19th century in Canada, including in what was then called Lower Canada. There's a character named Pierre Bedard, who was a real thorn in the side of the colonial administration, because he was leader of the Francophone Party in the Assembly, but he was a devotee of the British Constitution, and he was forever complaining that the executive in Lower Canada didn't depend upon the popular assembly for money. And so that's a violation of the British system. You're depriving us of our liberties. And he would reprint Delhomme in his agitating newspaper. Those were the days when that's the kind of thing people would print to rouse a rabble. But Delhomme said, it is a fundamental principle of English lawyers that Parliament can do everything but make a woman a man and a man a woman. Yeah, and of course now they can do that as well. But the danger, of course, is that if Parliament with that kind of power devoted to protecting your rights is taken over by people who are not interested in protecting your rights, it can take them away with a considerable ease. And of course, that was happening by the 1970s and